Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week is one of the more immediate implications of infection with COVID-19. An increased risk for children who are infected when it comes to diabetes. Interesting analyses about funding for different sources of vaccines. A study that looks at the differences for outcomes between male and female patients, and the world's tiniest antenna built from DNA. These and other news items are covered at the timestamps given below. Let's start with some news that's actually relevant to reproduction. Some people have argued that COVID-19 vaccines cause fertility issues. These people are wrong, plain and simple. Then there are those who are experiencing other effects. This is where one of the more interesting examples comes in. A man who claims to have shortened his scepter, so to speak, after being infected with the virus. It is known that infection with the CCP virus can cause erectile dysfunction and a variety of other similar issues. Shortening of an erection wasn't one that had come up on our radar before now. What is interesting is the diagnosis he was given, and that is the vascular tissue, which should constrict and dilate as needed for blood flow to engorge the penis, had been damaged. This meant that he was unable to raise his mass to the same extent as he was previously. This is just one example of the possible complications that can arise from viral infections that target indiscriminately every cell in the body. While respiratory systems are the primary area of interest, vascular and even other tissues again are of increasing awareness in various research circles. For example, case studies like this one. There are other considerations, and the one that's been raising alarm bells, especially with the spread of Omicron amongst children, is the increased risk of diabetes after they've recovered from a COVID-19 infection. The key takeaway before we get into any details of this study is that it was relatively small, based in a very specific subset, and didn't provide a lot of details around what they were doing exactly and what they found. The key result was that there was a 2.6-fold increase in new diabetes cases amongst children who had had COVID-19 in one group. In the other group, it was only 30% increase. Even if we're only going to focus on the smaller cohort increase, 30% is still a bigger increase than you'd like to see at any time. The further problem with this is that they don't differentiate between whether it was type 1 diabetes, which is not reversible, or type 2 diabetes, which can be treated to a certain extent and is often a result of a more sedentary lifestyle, something that has occurred in many regions due to lockdowns and similar restrictions on movement, especially among children. In relation to COVID-19, but going down a slightly different avenue, is an interesting article from Vice, and it looked at where funding went for different vaccines, and notably how open source vaccines got more funding from private companies than they did from governments. Admittedly, open source vaccines tend to be developed by much smaller groups. They certainly don't have the backing or means of mass production, but they're also often far easier to disseminate and have produced locally as a result. This has led to the interesting article. They found that one of the biggest backers of open source, or fundamentally free to make vaccines, was a vodka brand rather than a government. The differences between, say, a large company like Pfizer versus someone who's developed an open source vaccine isn't just how much it costs. The article in question has highlighted the difference very clearly. The most recent open source one, which has been at least approved in India, called Corbavax, costs $1. The Pfizer biotech vaccine costs $7. That's for each dose. That's a huge difference, but it also points out the clear difference between a company that is intended to run a profit and why they have to run a profit versus those that are basically developing this product separate to their main sources of income. For example, Corbevax was developed as an offshoot from a hospital service, rather than a pharmaceutical company. It is unfortunate that Vice's article does go into some detail on both how and why it was developed, but also goes on something of a tangent, primarily focusing on the differences of government and how places like the USA are currently holding on to certain stockpiles for their own use before going on to send excess materials and resources off to other countries. Unfortunately, the article makes a lot of promises about what could have been if the past had been different, primarily if something like Corbevax had been included in Operation Warp Speed. Unfortunately, as has been shown from the Sinovac vaccine, the reality is somewhat different. At least with regards to the Omicron variant, the kind of vaccine that they made isn't as effective. It is, however, still effective against the original 3 strains of concern, the Alpha, Beta, and Delta. This does mean that it's an interesting side note in history, and could have possibly provided some benefit, but there's also a lack of data about its use for Omicron, which is the current dominant strain. Saying what would have been if things had been different is 2020 hindsight, and everybody knows what 2020 was like. Hindsight's another factor that we want to talk about this week, and primarily the current demand that Joe Rogan have his podcast on Spotify effectively censored. There are a large number of doctors and scientists pushing for the Joe Rogan Experience to have some of the content on it moderated because they believe that it is misinformation, and especially medical misinformation, conspiracies, and similar. As much as we understand the rationale behind trying to censor Joe Rogan in terms of the medical misinformation on his podcast, we're also of the position that from a moral and principled perspective, muzzling him because you disagree with what he's saying isn't going to help. All it's going to do is drive these sorts of things underground, or change language in such a way as to try and avoid censure. This is obviously not something that's going to work. Directly addressing it and pointing out, here are the flaws and errors in what's being said, is really the only way to tackle this. Head on and directly. Asking Spotify to try and stop their most expensive and lucrative podcast from doing what it does isn't going to go anywhere. The money will win out in the end. Still on the medical avenue, but this time switching gears from misinformation and COVID-19 related content to instead surgical news. Specifically, one bit of research out of Canada that claims female patients will survive more operations when their surgeon is female than if their surgeon is male. This is a rather bold and serious claim, and it can really only be made for one simple reason. It's an entirely retrospective analysis where they haven't tried to explain the why, just describe the what. That's a big issue, but the research itself is for the most part solid. It looked at 1.3 million patients who went through 21 different kinds of surgery in Ontario, Canada between 2009 and 2019. That's a long period, a very specific subset, and a relatively large sample. When it was a male surgeon with a female patient, it was 16% more likely to result in complications, 20% more likely to remain in hospital for longer, and 32% more likely to die than when compared with a female surgeon. If it was a female surgeon and a male patient, there was still an increased risk to experience complications, about 2%, 13% more likely to die than if they had a male surgeon, but they don't specify whether or not there was an increase in the duration of hospital stay as a consequence. This is interesting as said, and it certainly could be important. At the same time, it is retrospective and it doesn't try and draw a relationship between the two. It simply states, there is something here, it needs to be looked into. and this is why retrospective studies are rather important. They can identify trends that are relevant, and they can also throw up many red herrings. Spurious correlations are spurious. Going from surgical news for the sake of surgery to instead surgical news that is a huge medical development. The first ever pig-to-human heart transplant. It's reasonably well known that pigs are genetically similar to humans. It's why, if things get very desperate, someone can have their blood filtered through a pig and returned to them. This allows for the pig's body to remove toxic metabolites. The problem is that this can't go on for long. The human body or the pig's body will start to attack each other. If that happens, then things are going to go very bad very quickly. This is also why we can't do pig-to-human transplants of organs, or at least until now. The surgery took place in Baltimore, Maryland in America, at the University of Maryland Medical Center. The achievement is not just that it's a transplant, but that it is a transplant of an organ that is infinitely more available than human organs are, as most Americans, as is true across most of the world, do not donate their organs. The ability to use organs like lungs, hearts, and kidneys that are often a byproduct and an unused one of abattoirs means that there is a large reservoir of possible organs that could be used to help sustain the lives of people who are otherwise not going to receive a transplanted organ. The reason this particular organ transplant has worked all comes down to the fact that they've been able to genetically modify the pig it came from to remove roughly 10 different gene functions, or at least alter them in such a way that they would not cause a human immunological response to the grafted organ. This is a complication observed even in human-to-human transplants, where if the donor and recipient are not perfectly matched, you will find that the organ is eventually rejected. The genetic modifications have largely mitigated this issue. While still on the topic of genetics, but switching gears entirely, this time going from genetic modification to the creation of tiny little structures using DNA, in this instance an antenna. The antenna being 5 nanometers in length. The development of this particular antenna is weird, but it has a very particular application: proteins. What it does is it will send out a particular light wave signal when the protein is behaving a particular way. It can also receive light wave signals and be able to incorporate them and make modifications. When you incorporate this into a protein structure, you can, in very simple terms, monitor the changes, the physical structural changes of the protein over time by both signaling and receiving signals from the antenna. This means you can begin to understand how proteins change as they go about their job, whether that is something very complex as a messenger inside a cell, or something far more senescent and inactive outside of a cell. Being so small, it can fundamentally work with just about any protein they can find a way to make it cooperate with. And that's big news, especially for proteins that are suspected to be involved in various diseases, but which, due to the nature of what they are, simply can't be observed. Going from the microbial that can't be observed to the microbial that can be. In this case, microbes that can create oxygen but don't require sunlight. It is well known that sunlight and trees will create oxygen so long as they have access to water. Algae do something similar, again via photosynthesis. In fact, that seems to be what most organisms rely on to create oxygen that we breathe. There is, however, exceptions to this rule, and this is one of them. It's a tiny microbe called Nitrosopumilus maritimus. There's also some other related species, but For the most part, that's the one we'll be talking about in this video. What happens is that they make oxygen, but they do so using a biological process that is not light dependent. The process used to establish this was reasonably straightforward. Collect a sample of seawater in which they know there will be cells of this species. Take that, put it into another container that's sealed in such a way that they'll deplete the oxygen in the water. Wait to see what happens with the water. Do they move in order to accommodate this, or do they stay where they are and somehow make up for it? In this case, they stayed in the low to no oxygen water and started making their own. What's even more quirky, let's say, is that they're somehow taking ammonia, the same sort of stuff used to fertilize fields, which is NH3, and turning it into nitrite, which is NO2 negative. This means that they're completely, somehow or other, converting it. They were then able to find some other byproducts of dinitrite. This means that they're creating a relatively complex series of products, and they have no idea just how they're doing it yet. The final bit of news this week is not so much news as it is a debunking. Not that long ago, there was a supposed mysterious moon cube. That is a square-like object that could be seen in the distance on the moon by the U2 rover. Well, people were interested, and for that matter, so were the researchers involved. The solution was fairly simple. China's National Space Administration sent it forward to find out what this mysterious cube was, dubbing it the Mysterious Hut. There was, of course, those who would inevitably say it was an alien house or spacecraft. These people were, perhaps, generously described as overly optimistic. The problem for this was just how far away the object was. 80 meters in space, or in this case on the moon, is actually quite a ways. It took roughly 3 months to get close enough to get a much better image. Once we had that image, it became clear. You would never be able to imagine what they found. It was a rock. They found a rock on the moon. That what we were seeing was simply an illusion of light and distance. The rock was unimaginably named Jade Rabbit, which, okay, but still, it's just a rock that looked somewhat more square-shaped from a distance. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.